If you want to make any significant changes in your life, then you must be prepared to go through a psychological process of death and rebirth, which, as you may expect, is not easy, but it's made even harder by the dark characters living in your mind that want to stop you from rising wiser and stronger. This short video is about how to escape the clutches of two of the most powerful shadow archetypes in the collective unconscious, the reclusive hermit and the shadow wielder. My name is Hazel Gale. I'm a former therapist turned author and creator of the fantasy mental health game Betwixt, which is where you can find my best and most creative tools for developing self-awareness and self-compassion. And this series of videos is devoted to the, in my opinion, fascinating world of archetypal character arcs. These are the archetypal journeys taken by characters so familiar to us from myth, tradition, religious teaching, and all other types of story, that they live within us as shared aspects of the personality, capable of influencing every part of our world, from our self-image right through to our life choices, our beliefs about what we can and cannot do, what we do and do not deserve. In this series of videos, I'm exploring the 6 archetypal story arcs that map onto the archetypal human life. But as you can see, I've given them all gender-neutral names, because I'm keen to make these journeys fully accessible and relatable for people of all genders, including the non-binary. All 6 of these archetypes bring with them 2 shadow archetypes. They're deeply destructive versions that, if we're not careful, that is, if our eyes are not open, can reach up and drag us down into the darkness with them. How do we stop this from happening? By building our awareness. As Jung taught, if we resist or ignore an archetype, it will possess us, not in its healthy form, but as its shadow. Bring that archetype into the light of conscious awareness, however, and it can serve as an empowering and very positive guide instead. This video then is here to help you awaken the seer within, and therefore guard against the threat of the inner hermit or the shadow wielder, and ultimately to emerge at the end of this journey transformed into the even more powerful and more magical mage. As explored in the previous video, the seer's journey is a pilgrimage to the underworld. Starting in a state of grief, the seer retreats to the cottage in the woods to mourn the great and powerful influence they had to sacrifice in order to complete their previous life arc, that of the sovereign. Now the kingdom is in danger again, this time from an unnatural death blight that's sweeping the land and leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Rallied by the pleas of a younger character, the seer eventually agrees to descend to the underworld, where they will reckon with death and put an end to the kingdom's unnecessary suffering. Then, after having successfully resisted the promise of immortality that they encounter on this journey, and ultimately found death to be not an enemy, but something closer to a friend, they have been able to say yes to life, and they are thus reborn. So, they emerge from the underworld with a near awe-inspiring level of wisdom that they're now able to share in order to help the struggling tenderfeet warriors, luminaries, and other sovereigns on their respective journeys. But, as if this wasn't hard enough already, it's not only the antagonists of death and the tempter that the seer must overcome. They also need to resist the lure of their darker sides, the hermit and the shadow wielder. If the seer fails to come to terms with the great loss of their previous arc, if they prove unable to process all that's happened to them and crucially come to peace with it, then they will either refuse to journey down into the underworld and face death, as in the case of the hermit, or they will go, but instead of re-emerging as the positive, life-affirming mage, they'll come back wielding the very shadows themselves. The passive shadow side of the seer's shadow self, the hermit, is the character who simply gives up the fight and resigns themselves to a quiet and doleful end. When dramatised, most of these stories will begin with the protagonist leaning towards their passive shadow side, sometimes the aggressive side, but that's less common for obvious reasons. With the seer, though, they will almost certainly start the journey as the hermit, because they begin in that quiet, introspective place of healing and processing. So the question here is less about whether they will slip into this side of their shadow, and more about whether or not they'll manage not to stay there. Now, I think regardless of whether we've reached the stage in life where we are forced to face our mortality with any kind of urgency, most of us know what it feels like to wonder if we have it in us to pull up our socks and carry on. The eddies of grief can easily suck us down into deep, deep water, and it can be hard to not just succumb. For examples of the hermit, think Aunt March in Little Women, Mrs. Snow in Pollyanna, and as mentioned in the last video, Tom Creo in The Fountain, who does claw his way out, but only after truly embracing the archetype of the hermit for a good while. In order to pass their test then, the seer's first challenge is to choose to fight their way back to that dark water's surface. If they fail, if they choose to just wait for death to take them, then the hermit has won. But languishing in the powerless hermit archetype is not the only shadow fate that threatens here. Should the mourning seer not prove able to come to terms with all that's happened, and instead resentfully turns against the world around them, then they will take the negative step towards the aggressive polarity of shadow wielder. Where the seer chooses life, the shadow wielder sides with death, but not the good reframed perspective on death that enables the seer to rise again. Instead, the shadow wielder, well, wields death as a threat and a weapon that they can use to extort and manipulate other people around them into meeting their needs, as do all the aggressive shadow archetypes. They reject the responsibilities of elderhood. They reject and hate other people and life itself. The shadow wielder is someone that is so lost to their own bitterness that they have come to see everything and everyone as a hateful reminder of their own pain. Just like the vampire that shadows the luminary, the shadow wielder is leeching life out of the more virile tenderfeet and warriors of the kingdom. That is to say that they are attempting to cheat death and claim the tempter's immortality for themselves. My favourite shadow wielder from pop culture has to be Evil Willow in Buffy. Unable to overcome the undue death of her true love Tara, Willow turns herself over to the dark side by first engaging irresponsibly with the death blight of a dark occultism, which is represented as a kind of magical opioid to which people are getting hopelessly addicted. Here, as in so many stories, magic represents power and wisdom, and black magic represents these things misused. Eventually, Willow is consumed entirely by this dark power and rises up as that season's big bad. She redeems herself, thankfully, but it takes much repenting and she's never quite the same again. Other examples of the shadow wielder include the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz, Fagin in Oliver Twist, and Captain Ahab in Moby Dick. So how do we avoid the clutches of the hermit and the shadow wielder? As with all these journeys, it's a case of fully integrating the empowering truth which, for the seer's journey, is the slightly cryptic, life is death and death is life. The seer's archetype's wise gift to us is the knowledge that in order to live life to the fullest, we must accept and embrace death. In order to fully embrace any experience, a job, a relationship, health, love, or any creative pursuit, we must accept that it will someday, one way or another, come to an end. Which means that it's okay to have lost and that we have suffered. That these things do not make us disadvantaged victims, but rather weathered humans with access to great wisdom. When we can do that, we will let go of the hermit's hopelessness and the shadow wielder's bitterness, and say yes to life, and then we will be reborn. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts about all of this in the comments, and I really hope it helps. Finally, if you'd like to take an epic journey through a magical world in the name of personal wellness and growth, then you can download Betwixt, the mental health game, which is available on the iOS App Store and Google Play.